Make sure you don't wait too long to get started. With my mental health, my physical health, everything's improved so much as a consequence, and it's something I do strongly recommend to absolutely everyone. You need to make sure you have some sort of plan in terms of sustainability of it. That's probably something that's had the biggest return on investment for me of anything I've done.
Hey everyone, welcome back to More Than Medics. Today we're talking to Dr. Lasith Ranasinghe. Laz is a dynamic anaesthetics trainee and entrepreneur. He is the co-founder of Finomics, an innovative platform addressing the financial needs of healthcare workers, and founder of the charity Make a Medic, which provides affordable, high-quality resources for medical students. Laz has also authored multiple books helping medical students succeed in their medical studies. With his unique blend of clinical expertise and passion for education and entrepreneurship, Laz is here to share his journey and offer invaluable advice for medical students and resident doctors alike. Let's dive in.
Welcome, Laz, to the podcast, the More Than Medics podcast. Last time we had a chat was in April, where you kindly gave us a lot of advice actually in starting More Than Medics itself. So really appreciate that. I guess there's a little follow-up and maybe you can give us some more advice. We're always open to it. So I guess to start with, you've done a lot of things. Not More Than Medics, Make a Medic. I get mixed up. Make a Medic, which is honestly, the first time I found out about it, Yasmin told me. It's just wowed at how it's just an amazing sort of initiative where you help med students, and in helping med students, you help other people as well. It's like a two in one. So that's wonderful. Love to explore that as well. But also Finomics more recently, which I know you started that when we had a chat earlier, and it's sort of early stages. It'd be good to see how that's going as well. So yeah, a little summary there, but could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself as well?
Of course, yeah. So just a brief synopsis. So I'm currently an ACCS anesthetics trainee based in East London in my second year of training. I'm working on ITU at the moment. I graduated from Imperial in 2020, and it was sort of during my time at Imperial that I kind of just explored these various sort of, I suppose, more than medics things that I could get involved with. And a lot of it just happened quite by accident, really. It wasn't necessarily that I had any sort of bright idea at any particular time. It's just one thing led to another, and over time you make lots of mistakes, you learn from them, and fortunately in my case I have ended up with something that's something that I'm still working on in my spare time, something that keeps me quite engaged, which is Make a Medic. And I feel like that whole experience equipped me with quite a few skills and quite a much better understanding, really, in terms of how to develop ideas and how to try and implement them. I'm by no means saying that I'm any sort of entrepreneurial genius. I feel like I'm still learning a huge amount day in, day out, and the things that I've created are generally pretty small in the grand scheme of things, but it's something that I certainly feel has added value to other people and certainly to myself as well. So briefly going over Make a Medic. So it's a charity. We produce medical educational content, which is available on a course platform for a monthly subscription fee. The idea is that it's content that's relevant, because I sometimes found that at medical school there'll be lots of things which are pitched at a level that's quite hard to digest, and that's quite often because there's somewhat of a disconnect between the lecturers who are delivering the teaching and the students who are receiving it. So the idea was, process all of the information, make it as aesthetic and digestible as possible to make the learning efficient. So that was the ethos behind the content production for Make a Medic. We also wanted to make sure it's accessible, because we know that people enter medical school in various different sort of financial circumstances, and access to good resources is never something that should have a financial barrier in front of it. So that was another key principle, I think, in the establishment of Make a Medic. And then people subscribe to the resources. We've got hundreds of people across the country and in a few different countries as well who use our content, and it raises a passive income, which we then put towards grants for public health / education related initiatives, primarily in East Africa, but we've most recently done a project in Sri Lanka as well. So that's Make a Medic. It's something that again, it's hard to say how much I do for it right now because I think it has got to a sort of stage where it's passively generating income, but of course it does require quite a bit of maintenance. It's certainly better suited to my current stage of life, just because working full time, I don't necessarily have quite as much free time to be able to continuously create new resources. But it's certainly something that I do keep working on. So even right now, I'm working on an ITU themed course, which I'm going to release via Make a Medic. Um, so it's something that I intend to keep, chipping away at over time. And it's actually quite nice to have something that doesn't end. It's not one of those things that reaches completion at any stage. It's just something that I continue to grow over time. So that's Make a Medic. And I'd say the second thing that I started working on more recently, it's a little bit off-piste for me, but it's a platform called Finomics, which is very much in its sort of embryonic stage. It was based on a problem that I personally faced and many junior doctors will face, which is that the pay that we receive is quite confusing. So our contracts, our tax, all of that stuff can get really quite confusing. And people who are working the same job, doing the same hours, can sometimes end up being paid quite wildly different sums just due to some sort of mathematical error somewhere along the pipeline. Um, that's compounded by the fact that a lot of medics don't necessarily know how a lot of this stuff works. All of this finance tax things, they're shrouded in jargon. It takes a lot of time to actually unpick it and figure out what's going on. And that's time that quite a lot of junior doctors won't have. So I think in the climate of these recent industrial action and issues regarding to pay, it just makes matters even worse when there's theoretically preventable issues or addressable issues that are affecting the financial health of junior doctors. So that's sort of in a nutshell what inspired Finomics, and the platform is intending to try and address these issues by streamlining the processes and the analytics involved in basically making sense of your payslip so that you understand whether you've been paid correctly or incorrectly, and you know exactly what you can do to receive the pay that you deserve. So that's something I'm working on with a couple of other very talented medics who are also extremely proficient in the field of sort of software engineering and coding. So again, very much early doors. I feel like Make a Medic and Phenomics are at sort of opposite ends of its lifetime at the moment, really, but it's still something that's quite exciting. Sorry, I'm monologuing for a while there, but I hope that gives
No,
a
no, no, no,
view.
good. With Phenomics, how are things now? Like, what sort of stage are you at now with in regards to starting that?
Sure. So, I mean, it's very much so. One thing that myself and Will, my co-founder, we were both very much on the same page regarding how we approach a startup, because sometimes you come up with an idea, you think it's really great, and in fact, you have probably quite a lot of encouraging people around you who, when you initially pitch the idea to them, they say, "This looks amazing, sounds great." Um, that's all well and good in the first instance, but it's really important to not just put your blinkers on and sort of get your head down and run in a direction without actually
Yeah.
checking in every now and then. Because you can end up going down rabbit holes and then not realizing until you have expended a lot of time and resources into something that isn't necessarily that fruitful.
Mm.
So one thing we did, I think, quite well actually from an early stage is that we essentially created a focus group. I sort of advertised the idea, I advertised the concept on LinkedIn, just as a mailing list, essentially saying this is what I'm hoping to do. If you're interested in trying it out, please sign up. And we were hoping for maybe like 10 or 20 people to sign up so that we can just bounce ideas off them. And we got about 300 people signing up within a day, which in itself was pretty good proof of concept because it suggested that there were quite a lot of people who are having this issue. So it's an issue that is worth addressing. Then ever since then, essentially, I mean, I'm very much on the non-technical side of things. I don't know anything about coding, so I'm absolutely dead weight when it comes to developing the platform itself. And Will is the person who's been doing all of that extremely well, doing a lot of hard work to create a platform. So essentially, we've been creating iterations of the product, even though we know it's not necessarily always going to be perfectly polished and ready to go. We wanted to just get it in front of people fairly regularly, especially given that we have the luxury of having a dedicated focus group who are interested in it, want to test it out and want to give their feedback. So we've done a few sort of internal releases since then where we've changed slight things. We've even, tried some new features as well, just to see how it sticks. And some of them have gone well, some of them haven't really picked up at all. And either way, it's a useful learning experience, even if something doesn't really get many people to bite. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that you have tested it early enough to prevent yourself from spending any more resources on it, and hence you can change direction. So basically, the long and short of it is that we've now got a better idea of the type of product that our users would like. It's just that from a technical point of view, it is quite a challenging thing to
Mm.
build, just because there's a lot of variety in terms of how people's pay slips appear. There's lots of things going on, lots of technical questions, which I certainly am not the right person to answer. But in essence, we've done several focus group trials. We've consolidated our idea of what we want Finomics to be, but we've remained
Mm.
open to the idea that things can change, that people might have different needs in the future, which will mean that we need to perhaps change tact at some point. And essentially, it's made us realize that with a startup, I mean, people usually fixate on coming up with an amazing idea like Facebook or Apple or whatever. But in reality, a lot of these startups, if you read through the history of it, there's a lot of like basically responding to feedback from users. You're essentially like the builder, and you're asking the users what they want you to build, essentially. And
Yeah.
that's the way that it works. It's not necessarily that we have a revolutionary idea and we're just building it and then releasing it. It's very much a two-way conversation where the audience will tell us what they need, and we do our best to build it for them. But yes, that's again sort of Finomics in summary.
I think that really then highlights the importance of problem-based research in a sense when it comes to startups,
Yeah.
etc. I'm quite interested though. So obviously you said earlier that, Phenomics is at its kind of startup stage, whereas Make a Medic is very stable at the moment. It's kind of on the other end of the spectrum. This kind of problem-based research iterations, did you do that as well with Make a Medic, or was that something that you learnt about, later on down the line after finalizing Make a Medic?
Yeah, that's very much with hindsight. Yes, it wasn't at all like I'd say. I mean, I was much younger back then. I mean, I started making medic in fifth year of med school, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I knew that I liked making med ed resources, and I made several mistakes or made several assumptions where I didn't really think critically about what the best way of going about things was. I certainly didn't really think twice about necessarily getting much feedback in terms of what format would be best for users. And I made plenty of mistakes along the way. I mean, I'd wasted lots of money trying to build MakerMedic's own sort of course platform, which was completely unnecessary because there are plenty of course hosting platforms which I can just, instead just pay a certain amount per month just to use. There's plenty of times where I'd made that exact mistake that I was talking about before, where instead of, getting someone getting some other opinions to figure out what the best course of action would be, I just bolt in one particular direction because I thought that was sensible, and end up spending a lot of time and resources heading towards the dead end, basically. So I'd say with Make a Medic, it was a much much more difficult process in terms of learning these lessons, because it was more a case of making lots of mistakes which were completely unintentional. Whereas with Phenomics, I think I wouldn't say any of the things that we are doing are mistakes per se, they're more experiments. So we'll implement something. We're not saying it's good or bad. We actually take a pretty scientific approach to it. So we'll create a new feature or something like that, and we'll say a positive result following our analysis would be that this many people sign up to it, this many people click this button. So we have quite an objective way of doing it, because I think with anything that you're creating or building, it's understandable that people can get quite attached to it, can get quite attached to the idea. They really want it to thrive. But in reality, you kind of need to take a step back, detach your ego from it, and analyze the feedback, the results as objectively as possible, because that's the best way of going about it. That's the best way of actually identifying what works. And I think with Make a Medic, I never really took that kind of scientific approach. I basically just did whatever I felt was probably right. Didn't really take the time to check check it with anyone else, and then ended up in a few tricky situations. But I think over time, as I've grown older and learned from those mistakes, I've headed towards something a bit more sustainable, and also much more manageable, with the life I'm living at the moment. So so yeah, it was a very different journey with Make a Medic. I think just because I was much younger, much more naive as well.
I think it serves as a lot of inspiration for med students as well, ourselves included, in that you can build something whilst you're at med school and just keep it going as well. It's not going to maybe crowd out the rest of your life or maybe your medical career. And as you said, it's passive for you now to a certain extent. So, I mean, I think that's always a good thing to think about for us.
Exactly.
Start or thinking about starting something. And yeah, obviously, it's so important, as you said, to put the problem first.
Mhm.
It's really easy, yeah, as you said, to just get obsessed with the solution, your miracle cure for whatever problem you think exists.
Exactly.
But in actual fact, it's getting that regular user feedback, putting the problem first, the users first, and then
Exactly.
iterating.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think getting as much data as possible from people is quite important because we all approach problems in slightly different ways. Because, for example, even before any of this Finomics stuff started, if I had, I mean, with my payslips and everything, I was always sort of documenting it in an Excel spreadsheet every single time I received one. Just because I knew that there were these payslip errors that happened, and I kind of wanted to at least have some sort of vague, rudimentary way of identifying any particularly frank anomalies. Um, but that's not to say that everyone does that. Actually, I'd say quite a minority of people do that. So that's the other thing to appreciate is that the audience is extremely diverse. Obviously, there's going to be some people who absolutely love what you're doing, and there's going to be some people who aren't at all interested. But it's just seeing how many people fall in that kind of middle of that bell curve, really, and who would actually use your product to a reasonable extent to make it worthwhile. So that's the other thing. I think a lot of people can fall into the trap of assuming that other people think the way that they do, and
Mm.
hence fall in love with your product and you're like, this is amazing. I can't imagine anyone not wanting to use it. But in fact, there's plenty of people who, for a variety of reasons, may not have time, may not be interested, things that don't seem to make any sense to you, but those that's still, part of the audience that you're pitching to. So I think trying to get feedback, objective feedback, and analyzing it as scientifically as possible helps remove your own preconceived opinions on how people should think about the product that you're pitching to them.
Mm. And as well as kind of making sure you're focusing on the problem, if let's say to us, you're
Yeah.
going to give us advice for, more than medics, what are kind of your top three pieces of advice for anyone trying to create a startup, especially let's say during med school where you are a lot more busier trying to manage your studies alongside the startup?
Of course, that's a good question. I think first of all, it would be it's a bit of a fine balance to strike, and I think it kind of depends on what type of platform you're creating. If you're doing something where you're trying to build an audience, which I believe is what More Than Medics is planning on doing, then I think it's important to strike a balance between making sure you have enough content prepared to be able to make it something consistent for enough time for you to be able to gauge whether it's worthwhile, if that makes sense. That's the slight difference, I think, when it comes to building any sort of audience, is that you need consistency. There's nothing more depressing than seeing, people trying to build an audience and then it all falling flat within a couple of weeks or a month or something. That's not really worthwhile. So I think there needs to be enough content prepared in the first instance to um, release things on a regular basis, enough for an unassuming user to stumble upon one of your videos or whatever, and then think, actually, this looks quite interesting, and then the next one gets released the following week, and they're like, actually, this looks really good. This is definitely something that's worth subscribing to. So that's one aspect of it. The second thing, though, is also to make sure you don't wait too long to get started, because it's quite easy to spend absolutely ages perfecting everything, um, and then eventually releasing it and then finding that no one's really paying much attention to it. So I don't really have a clear answer in terms of what the actual magic number is in terms of, content to produce, weeks to prepare ahead for. But I think it's important to make sure that you don't let sort of perfect be the enemy of good. You get things done sooner rather than later, get things out there and get the feedback. Um, but then also, if you're planning on doing something that's audience based or trying to cultivate an audience, you need to make sure you have some sort of plan in terms of sustainability of it. You need to make sure you can actually deliver, because all the algorithms nowadays as well are based on people being able to see fresh content all the time. So I'd say that's two important things. And I do genuinely think the biggest barrier is just getting started. A lot of
Mm.
people have certain ideas that they would like to bring to life, but never really happens just because they spend a bit too much time just thinking about it, or then, starting to get cold feet, thinking maybe it's not going to be good enough, etc. But what's the worst that can happen? You release something, doesn't really come to much. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's going to be worse if you just keep all of that stuff under wraps and never give it a go. So I think that's the other piece of advice, is just to not really take anything that fails to heart, because you can learn a lot from it anyway. I mean, there's been plenty of stuff that I've done where it's just been a complete flop, and I've sort of just moved on from it. I just know I shouldn't do that again, but I wouldn't consider it a complete loss. I've definitely learned something from it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think also as like medics, as professionals ourselves, we are we're very averse to failure or the prospect of failure. It's drilled into us from a young age. You know, you have to get a certain grade in GCSEs, your A levels, and throughout.
Yeah,
And failure is never an option, obviously. And so
exactly.
maybe in it, translating that to entrepreneurship and startups, maybe it's, we need to try and get over that sort of risk aversion that we naturally have,
Exactly.
and not be scared to sort of, think out of the box and, if something fails, so what sort of attitude. Maybe that's
Exactly.
like,
Exactly. And that's where, again, I think the whole experimental aspect of it comes into play. So, I mean, there's a lot of, I think startups have become such a thing in the last like 20, 30 years, um, that there's almost like a lot of science behind it now. There's plenty of books out there, like various like lean startup, personal MBA. There's all kinds of stuff there, which really does make it seem much more like a rigorous experimental or sort of scientific process, rather than something that is just a case of being some sort of charismatic Richard Branson, Mark Zuckerberg type. It's much more. It's actually much more sort of formulaic than a lot of people think it is. And it's something that can be reproduced the same way any sort of scientific experiment can be reproduced. And I think that's the beauty of it, really, is that if you start viewing it in that sense, then you just view things as experiments. I mean, imagine if you're doing your BSc or whatever, you're doing your various experiments in the lab, you wouldn't really take it that personally if something doesn't yield a
mm,
particularly impressive result. It's just part of the entire process. So I think it needs to be viewed in the same type of way. So rather than thinking that whatever you're creating is necessarily a reflection on yourself as a person, it just should be viewed as something that you're experimenting on over time, just to try and fine tune things and then make it better and better. And I think that's a much more um, that's a much more effective and objective way of going about things, really.
100%. And I want to ask, so obviously you mentioned, like we said, startups have become more of a thing within the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
How do you see the future of kind of healthcare entrepreneurship and startups?
That's a good question. To be honest, I'm not totally sure. Like I feel like it's there's definitely more and more and more people that I'm hearing either leaving medicine or just on the side doing other things, which I think is a good, well, not the leaving medicine part, but I think doing other things is always it's always nice to have a sort of diverse array of skills. Keeps life interesting as well. It's hard to say what's going to happen from this point onwards, to be honest, because I think at one stage it was quite novel for companies to have, someone who's got a medical degree on their staff. And I'm definitely not the right person to ask, because I'm still, working full time in the NHS and I love it. But I can imagine that over time, having doctors applying for these various other roles isn't going to be quite as novel as it perhaps once was. That's just my guess. I'm not basing that on any sort of solid knowledge. But I do think it's quite good that medics are starting to diversify a little bit and then think about other things that they can do. Because even from my own personal perspective, I've absolutely loved having things like Make a Medic and Finomics to work on. It makes me feel so much more sort of invigorated on a day-to-day basis. And it's just quite weird because it's a very different type of mental exercise. And I think I don't think it can all be grouped into one category because, for example, even yesterday I did a shift in ITU. I got back, I think, about 10ish. And I was kind of looking forward to, I ate some food and I was quite looking forward to just, because I had the day off today, I was quite looking forward to, making a list of all the things that I wanted to do today. A lot of, Make a Medic stuff, some Phenomic stuff as well. And I was quite excited about it. I was looking forward to it. I was able to, try and tee things up. And that only happened because I sort of felt like I was changing into a different costume, really. I was doing something completely different, stimulating myself in a completely different way. And it's been really, really great for my own sort of mental well-being, my physical well-being. Everything's been better as a consequence. So I certainly really do advocate making like, trying to find something that you can work on the side. So it doesn't need to be, a startup. It can be even exercise, wanting to get into running or and gymming or whatever. All of this stuff that doesn't necessarily have a set completion date is really, really beneficial because you always feel like there's something you're building or growing or getting better at. And I certainly think that like that's my I think on the whole that would certainly help reduce the rates of burnout even in junior doctors if they felt like they had another purpose aside from just turning up to work all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. Um, so I guess let's backtrack slightly to Make a Medic. I know you said more than medics again.
Yeah.
You started Make a Medic back in 50, you said. And what gave you the idea to sort of go global, I guess, in the sense that I guess a lot of your projects are in Africa. I think recently you said Sri Lanka, but because a lot of companies maybe would have or people would have thought, all right, let's just sort of help charities in the UK maybe, and sort of limit their sort of horizons there maybe potentially to start with at least. Why Africa or like global? Is there any reason behind that or any link for yourself?
So it was to be honest, I think it was sort of a natural extension of some other charity work I was doing when I was much younger. So when I was at school, I started this very little charity called Smile, and essentially, again, that was it's just one of those things that I again feel a bit like sort of happened by accident. But essentially, my birthday's in August, and August is obviously the summer holidays. That's pretty much the main time year on year that my family and I would go to Sri Lanka. So it sort of started off as me just collecting birthday money essentially. And I think this was when I was, can't remember, maybe like 13 or 14 or something like that. Collecting birthday money, going to Sri Lanka, and then usually using that to buy various things for orphanages or schools in Sri Lanka. So that was like but on a very, very minor scale. So I mean, that would be like max 200 to 400, £500. But obviously that goes a long way when you go outside the UK. So I think I was always quite interested in doing things in abroad, especially in countries which don't necessarily have the same resources that we have access to. And I think from a fairly young age, I could see how much of a difference it could make because, I mean, £200 doesn't seem like a particularly huge amount of money, even, I mean, 15 years ago. But in Sri Lanka, that could buy, beds, school uniforms, all kinds of things, basically. So I think that's made me interested in the idea of trying to raise the money here and then use that in as effective a way as possible in a country in sort of low and middle income countries, just because I felt like the effect that it has is magnified. So I think that's probably where the original idea to do projects elsewhere came from. And then the projects coordinator that I work with, close friend Tyra, she's got a background in global health as well. She's done a master's in it. So she did a lot of research into various health inequalities and issues that can be addressed in various parts of the world, including Southern and Eastern Africa. So she was a perfect person to be able to research all these other organizations, see what kinds of work they were doing, and also pick projects that we thought were going to be effective. Just because I think charities isn't obviously maybe done with all the best intentions, but it's not necessarily always done in the most effective way. So we tried to apply the principles of effective altruism to identify projects that we believe were sustainable and impactful in a meaningful way, rather than being just, just good for the cameras. So I think that's sort of where the idea came from, and since then we've sort of built our identity around focusing on low and middle income countries and primarily addressing issues related to public health and education.
Mm. I mean, that's absolutely amazing, the work you've done. And it really shows actually the impact that you can have. With your little startup of Make a Medic, it's now had such a global impact. Um, and I wanted to ask, what has been your most memorable project that you've done for Make a Medic? Or if you can't choose one, give us a couple.
I'd say, I mean, the one that I felt sort of closest to is we did a project in Zambia. So near Livingston, there's a small village called Nandu, which is basically a very, very rural village in Zambia. And it's the only project that I've been able to go and actually see being carried out. So there's a charity that runs there called the Butterfly Tree Foundation, and they had a really interesting model which I really like. Sarah and I really really liked. So they essentially helped support children, many of whom had been orphaned from a young age, basically get through school, get into university, get their degrees, and then they come back to the village to basically promote certain health practices, I'd say, and also, build houses. It's a case of actually equipping the people in the village to support the younger generations. So it's not a case of just blindly giving aid. It's a case of actually trying to, um, develop the right skills and knowledge amongst the people there to be able to improve life for everyone else there. So we went to so the project essentially had a few different aspects to it. One aspect was that the HIV prevalence is still pretty high in that part of Zambia, and it involved delivering essentially HIV prevention workshops to the children at a secondary school. Also because the teenage pregnancy rates were high, and of course that leads to school dropouts and plenty of other sort of social issues going down the line. So we funded the delivery of some workshops focusing on HIV and teenage pregnancy, essentially, which was delivered by people who had grown up in the village but who are now in their sort of 20s and 30s. So that was one aspect of it. The village, also a lot of the houses there are essentially mud huts with sort of thatched roofs, essentially, and they don't tend to last particularly long, especially because the weather conditions can be quite hostile. So when we walked around there, we saw that some of the roofs were basically just caving in, and hence, if it was raining, it would basically just flood the entire house, and it obviously made it quite difficult for just to survive really. So part of it also involved building a few new houses over there as well. So I'd say it really stuck with me mainly because we were able to actually go and see it for ourselves, because a lot of the other projects they send us photos, we have videos and all sorts of things. We speak to the partners, but we haven't got to actually be there and see things for ourselves. And I think being there made us realize just how difficult everything is for the kids in that school. And it just sort of humbled us really, just to make us realize the kinds of challenges that people face, and made us even more inspired to try and do as much as we can to help. But whilst we were visiting as well, we wanted to try and make sure it wasn't sensationalized in any way, because for these kids, it doesn't really make any sense to have a couple of foreigners just turn up and talk to them about anything. We wanted to very much just sort of um, just sit in the shade and just observe from a distance, really, just how this project was going, because I think it's much more meaningful and important for them to have all of these interventions delivered by people who they can relate to, like people who've grown up in the village, who've got through secondary school, got to university, they're starting to build their lives, and I think it was really nice to see that kind of model in action, and it made us like I mentioned, it just made us feel much more motivated to try and, raise as much money as we can and promote those kinds of projects going forwards.
Yeah, I do like that quite down to earth sort of approach to it, where you're actually looking at the problem and what the community there lacks,
Exactly.
and providing a means for that to, you know,
Exactly.
be a common, be yeah, to help that. And I think you know this case study we did in our BSc as is Play Pump. I don't know if you've heard of Play Pump. Have you heard of Play Pump?
Some sort of water.
Yeah. It's so I think some American entrepreneur came over to Africa at some point and tried to start this sort of water pump that basically children at school, the pump's at the school, and children can go to this pump, and it's sort of like like a merry-go-round type
Right.
deal,
Okay.
and they
Yeah.
sort of push it around, and the idea is by pushing it and playing with it, um, they generate water, they pump water for the whole community. But whilst that drives a lot of publicity and donations and
Exactly. Yeah.
whatnot, it doesn't actually work, and it didn't work because I think they worked it out, but the kids would have to work about play about
Yeah.
27 hours a day to get enough
Right.
water. And so I think they all got bored within the first 30 minutes. But no, the point is, yeah, actually, not glamorizing it, but finding a solution
Exactly.
that helps the problem rather than,
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. No, that specific example is there's a really good book called it's called Doing Good Better, which is about effective altruism, which I read a few years back, and I think it actually of that what you just described really brings
yeah,
about. Certain they
yeah,
mentioned probably in the opening chapter, but it's so easy to like do something that looks really really good on Instagram and will get quite a lot of attention from people in high income countries essentially, but that's
yeah,
not the purpose. It's all about and actually you know what, that kind of ties in quite well to the whole um iterative business side of things that we were talking about, that you want to, instead of just going down a rabbit hole, you want to make sure you test things, because hypothetically if they'd actually built one, seen how the kids interact with them, they were like, actually they're getting bored in half an hour, they
yeah.
probably would have gone around building them all over the place. So I think that ties in quite nicely, but yeah, that kind of encapsulates everything we've just spoken about.
No, yeah, yeah, funny that example that. Yeah, actually, can we let's go back to Finomics. I want to ask you, what obviously there's a lot of talk about, the financial situation of junior doctors at the moment, and how it's maybe not particularly ideal. I was wondering, as a doctor yourself, in the NHS, is all of that sort of true? Is it as bad as people make it out to be? And also, like that sort of situation that doctors may be experiencing, how does that impact maybe Finomics as well?
So I think it from a Finomics point of view, I do think it creates even more of a problem that needs to be addressed, just because people are already not particularly happy with the amount that they get paid for the work that they do and the amount of work that they do. And in that situation, and within that cohort of people who are unhappy, I'm sure there's actually a reasonable proportion who may be getting paid incorrectly or being taxed incorrectly. So if a lot of that, I mean, it's I think in terms of junior doctor discontentment, I don't think it's purely about pay. I think there's lots of other issues, just the structural issues, the infrastructure being quite poor. The fact that some people get sent to, millions of miles away from their friends and family to do F1 and F2. I think there's lots of other issues that can foster this kind of sentiment. But purely from, if we just focus just on a pay point of view, we're basically just trying to modify whatever is modifiable from our end. So obviously we can't do anything about the government. That's very much for the BMA to sort out. Um, but we can, at the very least, help ensure that all the maths and everything is done correctly, so that people are paid what they should be according to their contract, that they're deducted what they should be according to their overall earnings and their tax codes. Um, and also the other thing we wanted to try and focus on, this is probably a bit further down the line in terms of what we're developing, but and there's already plenty of people who are doing this type of thing, but I think medics are quite notoriously financially illiterate a lot of the time. Obviously, there's plenty of exceptions, but I think we spend so much time, learning about the body, how it works, how it goes wrong, etc., that we don't necessarily have conversations about finances. And in fact, I think if we're able to account for any tax errors or pay related errors, that's one aspect of it. And secondly, if we can in some way instill users with a better understanding of how to be financially healthy, or rather just to foster financially healthy practices,
Mm.
then I think that can hopefully alleviate some of the strain that's placed on junior doctors by pay-related issues.
Mm.
So I mean, it's stuff that can seem quite simple to a lot of people, but it's quite alien to plenty of junior doctors. It's we haven't really figured out exactly how we're going to go about this, and again, like I mentioned, there are plenty of resources that explains all of this stuff. Like Medics Money is one that's come out in the last few years, which does all of this. But essentially, just explaining how patients work, explaining, even interest rates, so mortgage interest rates, savings interest rates, the different types of savings accounts, stocks and shares, ISAs, all of this stuff in a very simple, digestible way. And the reason I'm kind of interested in that is I personally am interested in it just because to be honest, I think a lot of that stuff, a lot of the basic principles really aren't hard to learn, especially for someone who's learned medicine. It really isn't that hard to sit down, watch a few sort of Martin Lewis videos and make sense of a lot of these things.
Yeah.
It's a bit intimidating and it's a bit hard to get started because everything is very, very alien, but it all makes a lot of sense and it's very, very simple. So I think the make a medic teaching side of me wants to try and do something that helps people understand these kinds of concepts because I think it will definitely benefit them, especially further down the line, if they establish healthy financial practices at an early age. Because
Yeah.
there's a lot of I think misunderstanding really amongst a lot of junior doctors in terms of how to save, how to spend, how credit cards work, all of this kind of stuff. So that's another aspect of Finomics that I'd like to work on at some point in the
Yeah.
future. It's primarily the education part of it.
Yeah, I think that would like augment your the app that you're working on as well in terms of building up an awareness of surrounding issues, and then obviously you provide an application that sort of helps alleviate those issues, as well as the education that you provide as well. I think that'd be really. I would for one would definitely benefit. I have no idea what's going on. Um, yeah. And so with Phenomics as well. So I'm guessing because obviously you're creating an app that is maybe, requires a lot of work and time. How have you gone about like, I guess financially, funding it and maybe getting investment support or sponsorships, anything like that? How
Yeah.
have you gone about that sort of side, or have you needed to?
So to be honest, at this stage, we're still so all the advice that I'd got previously from people who have grown very successful apps, they've all mostly said try and do as much as you can before you involve any sort of third parties who will offer funding, which sounds great, but then I think the control that you have over the company, the demands that are placed on you, that certainly changes. And the main thing is that I mean myself and Will we've acknowledged the fact that both of us are also working full time, so it certainly is something that is very much something we're working on the side rather than something we can fully commit to at this stage. So basically, thus far, we've got a couple of extra hands on deck from a coding point of view, where we're trying to keep everything as tight-knit as possible and just assessing the workload as we move forward, really. So I think that's the important part of it is just checking in on a regular basis and just being honest about how much time you have to commit to it, really. And in the early stages of any startup, I think lots of the time it's to do with splitting equity, really, and then hopefully at some point when it does start to kick off or you get some funding, then everyone can feel adequately remunerated. But the important thing is I would say a lot of people who get involved in startup at an early stage are not necessarily in it just for the money. Obviously, that's a that's a sort of long-term aim, and that would be amazing to have a passive stream of income because of something you've created. But I think a lot of people do it, myself certainly, just because it's interesting, it's stimulating, and it teaches you a lot as well. So that's sort of the way that I've got chosen to go about it, is actually not focus too much on the financial side of things, especially if it's something that doesn't necessarily require that it doesn't have particularly high overheads. So that's why, content creation and stuff is pretty good, just because you don't really have to invest much to get started. Aside from your own time, obviously that's not for free per se.
Mhm.
But even like a podcast, for example, you get yourself a podcast mic, you've got a laptop, and you're ready to go. That's basically it. So, um, yeah. So I think it's from a Finomics point of view, we're trying to do as much as we can with the human resources we have available to us, whilst also regularly checking in to see at what point we would need to perhaps get a little bit of extra help.
There's two things I wanted to ask based on what you said there.
Mhm.
Firstly, you mentioned how you reached out to a lot of people to get advice. So, how important is mentorship in a startup or throughout an entrepreneurial journey?
Um, Definitely super, super important. And I think it needs to be like I just think it's quite important just to get sort of objective opinions. I think it's quite hard to find mentors who have necessarily done something quite similar. But myself and Will, we've had a few meetings with people who've been involved in the business sector and were able to give us some quite useful advice. And I think it can be a bit of a scary experience because sometimes they can tear things apart, and that does feel bad when it's happening, but it's actually super useful going forward. So I would say it is definitely very important, but I think it again depends on the context really. I think whenever you feel like you can learn something from someone else about whatever you're working on, then just take that opportunity. But at the same time, it's not something that should necessarily stop you from getting started. So, for example, if you're trying to start a podcast, of course, you should speak to people who've done that before just to get tips on, even things as simple as what's a good podcast mic, and how often to post, when to post, that kind of stuff. It's quite useful to find out from people who've made it work, how they made it work. And a lot of the time, I do find that they're quite happy to talk about it because obviously it's a success story for them. So I would say it is important, but I'd say at the same time, um, it's not a prerequisite per se in terms of getting started. You just do need to have a think, consolidate your plan, have this sort of initial launch plan in place, and have some metrics that you want to objectively analyze to kind of determine how successful it is and what you can work on. And then it's just a case of getting the ball rolling, really.
That's really useful, actually. And then my second question was about teams, because you were mentioning how you're still trying to evaluate whether you need more people on board or
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
So what's the best way to kind of build the best team that you can?
sure.
Um, and how do you deal with situations where maybe people's expectations in the team are
Yeah.
not quite aligning?
That's a that's a really good question. And to be honest, I don't think I'm a very good person to answer this because I've been notoriously bad at um I'd say hiring people in the past. Um I think, to be honest, part of it was it's a bit different. I'd say a lot of my experience in recruiting people has been within Make a Medic. And that's obviously a very different type of domain where everyone is a volunteer. Uh, so that I personally found very tricky throughout, basically, just because, um, especially as the brand grew and got a bit more recognition, people were much more keen to get involved and have some sort of association with Make a Medic. However, I very, very often found that enthusiasm wasn't necessarily correlating with the outputs that they were able to produce. Medics on the whole, I don't mean to generalize, but I think my um, it's a bit cynical of me, but I've personally found that there's a lot of medics who can be super, super enthusiastic, say all the right things when I interview them, and get started very well, and then eventually just lose steam after not a whole lot of time. So I'm honestly not particularly good when it comes to picking the right people for certain roles. And I'll be totally honest with you, I'm not going to be able to give you any specific advice on that. But I think one point I'd like to add to it is just that you don't necessarily want to recruit for the sake of recruiting, if that makes sense. And I've definitely done that before as well, where I've just sort of randomly created ill-defined roles for absolutely no reason.
Mm.
And I think back and I'm like, why on earth did I bother doing that? Because I think onboarding someone has its own overhead in some sense, because you need to fill someone in, you need to get someone to produce stuff in the same way as you. And I think over time, I've become a bit better at figuring out when I actually need someone and what specifically I need of them. So again, I'm really not the best person to ask in terms of how to recruit people, but one point I would make is just to make sure that the job role is very, very clearly defined.
Mm.
Um, and I'd say also, ideally, a lot of the time, it's probably best to go with people that you can have a fairly professional relationship with as well. So obviously, you want to be mates with these people, but I don't think it's always the best idea to just get all your friends to do the various jobs that you need for
Yeah.
whatever organization you're running.
Yeah, because
Yeah, it's
sometimes
difficult, isn't it, during the, oh, sorry, carry on.
you go, Martin.
No, it's just, yeah, when you do hire people you know, or not hire, but work with people you know, um, I'm guessing there's a lot of like, you don't really know where the boundary is because, or like how
Exactly.
much rope you can take because,
Exactly.
or they can take because how much is it you being nice to them, and maybe that could go too far in the sense that they're just not
Exactly.
pulling their weight, and so that's
It-
difficult. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So I think that's a problem that's just best just avoided on the whole. But I think with anything that's being done as a sort of extracurricular activity, which I assume is what most of the audience of More Than Medics would be engaging in, I think it's also important to set expectations in terms of how much time you have available. So I think the one of the few things that I did well in terms of the whole sort of hiring side of things is establish when people's exams were and when people were likely to be out of action, just because then it helped me have a better idea of when I can and can't contact them or ask them to do certain things. So yeah, so I think time allocation, clear deadlines, clear job descriptions are the keys really.
Yeah. On the topic of time as well, how do you manage your time? Because you obviously must be it's quite a busy man doing everything you do, and then also like you must be doing it fair. Like you must be working technically. I'm guessing you enjoy a lot of what you do though, but working technically a lot of the day. I was wondering also like, well, so firstly, how do you manage the time? But also like, what drives you? Is it just intrinsic, or how much of it is like you're sort of making yourself do it, or
Um,
like there's another reason? Yeah.
I'd say I'm genuinely just someone who absolutely loves like a longitudinal project to work on, and
Yeah.
really, really does drive me. So I don't. So I'd say that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, which I think is absolutely crucial for everyone, and is completely sort of seems a bit random, but is exercise as well. Like I personally found that. I think a lot of people can start F1 and F2 previously, in med school, you have loads of free time. So you can be doing your exercise, whatever, and then start F1 and F2. And I think also there's this expectation almost that F1 and F2 is so emotionally and physically rigorous that you have absolutely no time to do anything else. And of course, it can be tough at certain times, but I really don't think it's helpful at all to start F1 with that mindset,
Yeah.
because then that means that you're going to be far more lenient with yourself when it comes to going to the gym class or going for a run or whatever. And that just sets you back going forwards. But you want to establish really good habits from an early stage. And you just want to make time for these things which are super important for yourself as an organism, essentially. So one thing that I literally always do is I try and go to the gym and go for runs at least 6 times a week ish. And I think that really helps like focus myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's basically just it's very simple stuff, to be totally honest. I have this I have just a notebook where I just write a list of things that I want to get done in the day. And like I think because of the regular exercise as well, I don't feel tired particularly often. I try and eat as well as it's really mind-numbingly
Yeah.
simple, but it's stuff
Yeah.
that a lot of people completely forget about or don't think is as important as
This
it
is
is.
something we tell the patients, but we don't. We don't.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. That's a very good way of putting it, Martin. Yeah. So I think I genuinely think just getting the treating yourself, your body, yourself as an organism, giving it what it needs in the first place is where you should start. So
Mm.
making sure you sleep enough, eat good food, and exercise enough. That's sort of a baseline. And that's one of those things that I really think people should prioritize a bit more, because I don't think it's something that is viewed as being kind of optional. Like, sometimes you're like, maybe I should do a bit of exercise or whatever, but I actually think physiologically for our bodies, we just need to do it. And so
Mhm.
I always like, doesn't matter how busy I am, I do my best to just carve out time for those specific things, because if I don't do those, I basically just can't do anything else going forwards. It makes me deeply inefficient moving forwards. And then it's just a case of like I mean, I still do have quite a few off days, because in ITU we have our long days are usually about 13 hours. So that means that we do get 0 days to compensate. So when I have those off days, I usually just pick something specific that I want to focus on. So I think the other issue is that lots of people can have loads and loads of various things that they need to get done, and hence nothing really gets done because they feel like there's just too much going on. Whereas I'll just focus one day being like, okay, there's this ITU course I'm working on. I want to get to this stage by the end of today. Everything else, you know what, I'll sort it out some other time, and just focus in on that. Because or else you just get a bit, you can get paralyzed by the volume of things that you need to get sorted. And the other thing is just not leaving things is the other thing that I think I do quite well. There's lots of tasks. If you look at your to-do list, I'm pretty sure there's lots of tasks that you can put into the sort of less than 5 minutes category. So things like replying to an email or something like that. So easy to just push back, but it actually doesn't take that long to sort it out. So generally speaking, if something takes less than 5 minutes, I just wipe it out as soon as possible, just because it's much better that way. And the final thing that I've done better recently than I used to is that I don't sign up for too many other things. I actually don't do that many different things. I just pick a few things and do quite a lot for them, if that makes sense. So I only agree to do something if I'm actively excited about it. I don't do anything if people, certainly not if someone else says that they think it'll be. I think F1s quite often get told that they should get involved in this audit or something like that. And they're not in the slightest bit riveted by it, but they feel like they should do it because someone else said that they should. So I don't do that ever. And yeah, so it's only if I'm like actively excited by something that I would choose to do it. Everything else, I try not to feel any sort of sense of obligation to do anything. I would just get involved if I actually feel like even with this podcast today, like I liked what you guys were doing, and hence I wanted to be a part of it. But anything that falls short of excitement, essentially, I just say, sorry, I'm not gonna get involved. I'm just gonna carry on with my usual things. So I'd say that's the main ways in which I sort of balance my time, as vague as vague as that advice was.
No, excellent.
That's really useful to hear. And actually, thanks for thinking that our project's really exciting. That's really good. And I think it is just like the importance of assessing your priorities, because there are so many opportunities out there, and it can be really overwhelming. And yes, maybe you'll learn something from one compared to the other, but you have to really assess, okay, what do I really want to do? What
Exactly.
really excites me? And
Exactly.
I think what you mentioned earlier about looking after yourself, I think we're taught through our med school that you need to compromise one thing, either
Exactly.
compromise your exercise in
Yeah.
order if you want to go out, or to study well, you need to like have a lack of sleep, work harder. But I think it's about being smarter with what you do, I guess, being more
Absolutely.
efficient. And I think I was listening to a podcast actually where, for example, they're talking about exercise, and a lot of people view it as optional. But actually, would you view brushing your teeth as optional? No. So
That's
kind of
exactly it.
thinking
Yeah.
of it in that mindset of, okay, exercise is
Yeah.
something that I have to do as part of my routine.
Exactly.
Uh, and also the idea of kind of being flexible. So, for example, with exercise, you don't necessarily have to go to the gym. You could go, like Rangan Chatterjee mentions, five
Yes.
minute exercise while you're boiling the kettle,
Exactly.
having a little step, etc. So I guess it's about adapting what you do to ensure that even if you have that busy schedule, you're
Of
still
course.
keeping up that routine.
Exactly, yeah. And I went through this is very tangential, but I went through a phase where I was reading a lot about sort of human evolution and anthropology and various things like that. And essentially it occurred to me that we've still got the same sort of anatomy and physiology of a hunter-gatherer from 100,000 years ago. And it's only very recently, like literally in the last less than 100 years, where we've suddenly gone to just sitting at desks on laptops all the time, eating, all of this like ultra processed food. Like it's all exceptionally new, and hence our bodies are millions of years of evolution is not prepared to deal with that. So whatever is like all the stimulus that's around us at the moment is completely bizarre for the genetics that created us in the first place. So that's why I try to just view myself as hunter-gatherer from 100,000 years ago to be like, right, okay, so what would I normally be doing on a day like this? Probably
Mm.
running for a while, probably eating some fruit, like doing all of those things, and just trying to view it in that sense and try and make sure I do my standard physiological requirements essentially for the day. And
Mm.
then I feel much like I genuinely it's just my mental health, my physical health, everything's improved so much as a consequence. And it's something I do strongly recommend to absolutely everyone. Yeah.
Mm. And I want to ask as well, how did you develop the kind of the confidence to kind of go out of the conventional trajectory of medicine of, just being a medic and, for example, exploring those entrepreneurial ideas? Well, I guess it's been in
Sure.
you since 13, 14 years old when you said you were doing it. But yeah, what gave you that confidence to actually go out the box?
Sure. I think, to be honest, again, this is one of those things where I'd say it's less to do with me and just to do with the setting that I was in. So, I mean, because at med school, like so much of this stuff completely happened by accident. It wasn't by any means me being particularly entrepreneurial or taking much initiative. But basically, like so you guys are what final years now, right?
Not quite.
Both
One more
things, yeah.
after this.
The
Yeah.
fifth years.
Yeah,
Fine.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Wait, when did you start? Well, wait,
2020. So our
you
first
started
year.
in 2020. Fine. Okay.
September, yeah.
Yeah,
Fine.
so
Okay. Oh,
when
so
you
I'd
graduate,
graduated by that time.
yeah.
Oh, fine, fair
When you
enough.
were
Okay.
at BNOC earlier, I've always heard about you at Imperial.
But yeah, so I mean, so basically, because I started med school in 2014, like I think the way that Making Medic came about was completely and utterly accidental and much more to do with the ICSM setting than anything else. Just because, like obviously, I released my notes and stuff in first year, and then I absolutely did not expect everyone to start using it and it to become as much of a thing as it did. And then I
Mm.
think that gave me this confidence that I never had before. Just the fact that people were like liking the resources and stuff. I never ever thought that would happen. Like I still
Mm.
remember in first year or second year, perhaps it was one of the first years just asked if I had some notes, and I just sent a link just to one person. That was it. I just left it at that. And then all of a sudden, like a few weeks later, all of them were using it. And I was like, what on earth is going on? So I think that that made me feel a lot more confident in terms of I don't know, my ability to create a resource that would be useful to other people. So I think that was definitely a seminal point, essentially. Like the fact that people were using the notes made me feel like I had some degree of credibility. So that's when, like in third year, then I wrote my first book, and I only did that because I had the prior knowledge that people liked the way that I created resources. So it was sort of like a stepwise process. So I think just sharing the notes in the first year, writing the book in third year, and thereafter I felt like I'd developed a bit of a reputation to be able to use to sort of leverage in creating a platform. So again, like I mentioned,
Yeah.
completely accidental. It was just a consequence of like if I hadn't shared that link in second year, I don't know if any of this stuff would have happened. It's really hard to say.
Mm.
But I think it was just a case of in my case, completely accidentally putting stuff out there and people liking it, but people can also intentionally do that as well. So I don't think people should be. I know it can be scary, like creating something, putting it out there, because you know what's going to happen. Like people might not be quite as positive about it as you'd hope, but on the whole, I think once you'll never be able to answer that question unless you do actually release something in the first place. So that's again boils down to the point of just getting started. And if things don't work out with whatever venture you set about, it doesn't mean that nothing will work in the future. It just means that you need to just realign. So I think that's so my confidence definitely just came completely accidentally. It wasn't based on anything. It was just based on sharing a link in 2015.
Well, I hope
Yeah.
if this also raises your confidence, I still use your notes till this day. I'm
Yeah,
still
I was about to
when I
say.
started fifth year.
It's been passed down, what, it's 6 years now. Or when did you share it? What year were you?
So I shared my first year notes. It would have been in 2015 by the end of first year. Yeah.
All right, so it's
Brilliant.
nearly made a decade then.
Gosh, that is mad. So, I hope it's still relevant. I don't know how much medicine has changed since then.
Yeah, you said you wrote your first, but how many books have you written?
I've written four now. So three of them were
Wow.
SBA books, and the most recent one, which is sort of like a clinical reasoning book. So so all I think was it all three of them? So all three of them. So the first three, sorry, the first three SBA books I wrote in third, fifth, and I think F1.
Mm.
And the clinical reasoning book I basically finalized it in F3. That
Earlier
was
this year, wasn't it?
yeah, it was released in like March or April or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that was a much more challenging book to write. Just because there's a lot of graphics, there was a lot of like actual content. It's more of a textbook than anything else, but
Mm.
I learned a lot from doing it as well. So I think that's the other thing is just keeping your like you don't want to have too many things on the go, but at the same time you do want to seize interesting opportunities when they arise. Because the reason I wrote that, like I had absolutely no intention after the first three of ever writing a book again, just because it is quite an exhausting experience. But then during my F2, I worked in St. Mary's A&E, and then during my F3, I was sort of locuming there quite sporadically, and I just so happened to come across a few Imperial medics there, and just having conversations with them, they were like one of them. I remember saying something very specific, which was like to do with creating some sort of flow chart that helps them make sense of a history. Because they kept on saying that when they take a history, they're still constantly thinking of what's the next step in taking a history, rather than it being a case of following a narrative and asking appropriate questions at certain times with the view of, checking whether it's something that could be very sinister or something that's less of an issue, differentiating the diagnoses and actually using it as a as a way of actually differentiating the possible underlying causes of the patient in front of you. So like that sort of like rung this alarm bell in my head where I was thinking, actually, I've just seen thousands and thousands of patients in A&E, and I feel like I've got to a point where I am sort of taking a history and I know which red flags to ask about. I know this and that. And I do actually have this kind of formula or this flow chart in my head, which I could probably put onto paper and write about. So that's sort of where the idea came about. I really wasn't intending on doing that, certainly not during F3 because I was abroad a lot. But it just the opportunity came about. I had a publisher that was interested and a couple of people to help me and sort of one thing led to another. But yeah, so I think it is important to just be open to new opportunities, but at the same time not to just indiscriminately take new opportunities on board because then you just end up doing nothing really.
Mm.
Yeah. That's amazing how you've written four books. I don't know. I don't remember the last time I've written something that was meant to. I wasn't forced to write. Um, no, people keep telling me I should journal and things. It's probably a good idea. But like, what are the benefits, would you say, of, putting all your thoughts down onto paper? Would you say it helps you in any other tangible way, would you say?
So I'd say so one other habit that I've got into, I think probably in the last, actually probably since I graduated, I'd say, is just reading a lot. And like I read as much as I can, and I try to get through maybe about 40 to 50-ish books per year. And I think that's probably something that's had the biggest return on investment for me of anything I've done in the last 5 years. Just because it's it almost feels like a cheat code really in life. The fact that someone could have lived an entire life, had all of these various experiences, and then they distill it into 300 pages, which is basically a manual, and then you can just read it and then get all of that in those insights in the space of a few hours. So I think reading has it has so many benefits that I struggle to even figure out how to articulate it. Um, but I think it's first of all made me much much better at interviews initially. Strange thing to say, but I think when you read something, it's a constant task where you're processing language, essentially written language. And I think that must make some sort of changes in your brain that makes you better equipped to actually deal with other forms of literary stimulus. So if someone's put a case in front of you at your interview that you need to read through and convey some sort of response, or you're getting asked questions in a Viva, for all of that stuff, I think you become a little bit quicker and sharper if you're constantly consuming written language. It's
Mm.
sort of slightly meta way of describing it, but I definitely feel like it made a palpable difference to my performance at interviews, having read quite a few books. Um, Secondly, I think whenever you have some sort of topic that you're interested in, if you just do a deep dive into it and read loads of books, you feel like it really gives you a quite a deep understanding of it, which is more likely to withstand the tests of time than just watching a YouTube video or a documentary or something like that. So I do the slightly strange thing where I kind of read in themes. So I'll pick a theme that I'm interested in. Like at one stage, I wanted to learn about Black history, so I'd make a list of 20 books and just go through them basically. And then went through a stage where I was reading lots of feminist books. Basically, I just try and do deep dive after deep dive, and then I feel like I have so many more things that I know enough about to have a conversation with someone about. And that certainly helped, even with patients, to be honest. There's been plenty of times, especially in London, you meet every possible subset of the human spectrum in A&E in London. And there'll be plenty of times that you find that there's something you can really closely relate to them on, which they can't usually speak to other people about, or they don't feel like anyone else has any awareness of it. And that's a really sort of special connection that I've really come to appreciate in A&E, and I certainly wouldn't have had that if not for the fact that I'd been reading quite a lot. So yeah, so I'd say reading certainly has been something that's benefited me massively. And as a sort of step on from that, I'd certainly think writing things down and putting your thoughts on paper can just help organize your brain, really. It's a form of mental hygiene, really, because there can be lots of stuff that's just wiring around in your brain that you're not particularly aware of. And in a way, it can sometimes slow you down because it just affects your focus. Whereas I think when you sit down, you write a list, you journal a little bit, then you feel like everything's a bit decluttered and you have a bit more focus, so you can actually get on with your day. So all in all, yeah, I think reading and writing together, fantastic. Again, all of these are very basic principles. I basically just said eat, sleep. Um,
No, it's
yeah.
true though. No,
All
and I guess you consume a lot of information then in a year. That's 50 books. Do you have a method of so obviously do you write down what you read after it? Like do you like try and summarize it? Do you have like a sort of system? Because I know when I read a book,
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time on it, and oftentimes, to be honest, I
Yeah.
forget like 99% of what's gone on inside.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, of
Uh,
course. Of
do you
course.
have like a yeah?
I do, yeah. So I do have a system for it. I'm a Kindle reader and I listen to audiobooks every now and then as well. So first and foremost, I'd say things that I listen to on audiobooks tend to be things that you don't need to really maintain that much attention for. Because I think it's very hard to like completely like focused on an audiobook. So I wouldn't read anything that's particularly technical. Well, listen to anything particularly technical as an audiobook. It's usually like biographies and things like that where you can sort of just, let it just drift off in the background. Um, Kindle, I absolutely love Kindles. Honestly, completely changed my life. I've even got a. This is how extra I am. I've even got this like Kindle holder, which is like an arm that extends from the top of my bed.
I like one of these, but for a Kindle.
Yes, yes, exactly, like that, and I can adjust it, and I've got a Kindle clicker as well, so I don't have to actually touch the screen.
Oh, that's
Uh,
amazing.
Honestly, best £30
That's
I've ever.
next level Kindle reading. Wow.
But on Kindle, the good thing is that you can sort of highlight things that you want to. So you can highlight things, keep reading, and then at the end you can log on to Kindle on Google, and then you can see all your highlights. So then I basically just transfer that across onto a Notion thing that I have. Um, so it's basically that's my method really. So I just highlight things that I think are interesting, transfer them onto Notion, and then I have them all saved somewhere that I can look through at some point in the future if need be. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll just go for the notepad approach. But yeah, I need to. Yasmin's sort of my organizer. She helps me sort of tethers me to the real world where people have calendars and whatnot. But no, that's good. Oh, we've learned so much, and it's been such a nice conversation, and I'm sure like hopefully viewers have benefited as well a lot. Maybe just to finish, what's like maybe a single piece of advice you'd give to maybe med students today in the UK?
Um, One bit of advice I'd give, it's quite hard to think of one.
Yeah,
But
it doesn't
I
have to be one. I said one. Could be.
sure. Let me go with two. So first of all, don't subscribe to the whole doom and gloom of being a doctor thing. So I appreciate it can be hard. There's lots of issues that need to be addressed. That goes without saying. But at the same time, you work very hard to get where you are. You're doing a course that I'm hoping you enjoy. And you should be excited about starting work. You shouldn't be going in dreading it and thinking it's going to be awful. I just don't think that's a good way to start a career. And you want to sort of enter it with a degree of positivity. And on that note as well, I think it's important to just realize that you can have. I'd say my second point is that you can actually have a massive impact at any stage. So people often think that, maybe I need to wait, gain a bit more experience, learn some things, develop some skills before I can actually make a difference to anyone. But you're already in a position to be able to make a difference to anyone. We all have our own sort of social gravity, which exerts its impact on the people around us. So that applies to, starting up something. So get started, learn from the experience, grow from it. And also it applies in the context of work as well. So people always say that work environments can be taxing, but it's not an environment in which you're just this kind of idle component. You're someone who does contribute to the environment as well. And hence you actually have the opportunity to make it more positive. So it can be hard. There's plenty of times when it'll be really, really rough. But on the whole, it's a really amazing job. It's a job like no other. You get to make a difference to a lot of people, and it's something that you should be excited about. So I'd say those are my two main tips for any current medical students.
That's amazing. And just finally, how can people stay in contact with you?
Stay in contact with me. So I'm LinkedIn, Instagram, all of that stuff. I'm not a TikTok user or anything. I think I'm too old for that. But yeah, LinkedIn or Instagram is probably the best way of getting.
And make a medic as well.
Of course.
Buy those resources. Amazing.
Yeah. So I try and keep it cheap. I mean, it's just one of those things that's it's just nice because it runs in the background. People can access it fairly cheaply, and every year we can do a couple of interesting projects with it. So all in all, it feels like a win-win.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Les.